The night was particularly dark, and the train rolled through the tunnel with a heavy vibration, as if it were carving a path to hell. The metallic clatter of the wheels and the howl of the wind intertwined in a symphony of dread, while the carriage was illuminated only by a pale green light that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond human understanding. Shadows moved like living entities, warping and twisting into threatening forms, as the faceless passenger remained in his seat, a static and terrifying figure. The train appeared to be in a place between the world of the living and the dead, a corridor to the unknown where the laws of reality disintegrated. With the irregular movement and unsettling sounds, it was impossible not to feel that something unimaginable was about to be revealed. And amid this chaos, the enigmatic presence of the faceless passenger seemed to be the missing link between the terror and the hidden truth that awaited at the climax of this macabre journey. The train rolled through the inky blackness of the night, its wheels clattering rhythmically against the rails. Inside, passengers sat in uneasy silence, their conversations stifled by a creeping sense of dread. In the midst of the crowd was the enigmatic passenger without a face. He sat motionless, cloaked in shadow, his presence barely perceptible but palpably disturbing. The dim light flickered intermittently, casting long, twisting shadows across the train's interior, and every so often, a chill ran through the air as if something malevolent was just beyond the edge of sight. The murmurs of the passengers began to fade into a hushed whisper as the train passed through a dense fog that seemed to envelop everything outside the windows. The fog pressed against the glass, distorting the view into a swirling vortex of darkness. Inside the train, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with a sense of impending doom. The passenger without a face remained unchanged, a silent observer of the rising tension that enveloped the car. As the journey continued, strange occurrences began to manifest. Passengers reported seeing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures darting past their windows. Whispers of ghostly apparitions filled the air, heightening the sense of paranoia. Every slight sound, every creak of the train, seemed amplified by the collective fear. The passenger without a face continued to sit in stillness, as if feeding off the growing anxiety that gripped everyone else. Then, without warning, the lights flickered violently before going out entirely, plunging the train into a suffocating darkness. Panic erupted among the passengers, their previously subdued fears transforming into outright terror. The train seemed to shudder, and the temperature plummeted. The only sound was the rhythmic pounding of the wheels against the tracks, now ominously steady. The passenger without a face remained an immovable fixture, a haunting presence in the midst of chaos. When the lights came back on, they revealed an even darker reality. The fog had seeped into the train, and the walls were now covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe and change shape. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy. The passengers looked around in horror, trying to make sense of the inexplicable changes around them. The passenger without a face continued to observe, his hidden gaze penetrating through the palpable fear that enveloped the car. The train had reached a point of no return, a junction between the known and the unknown. With every mile traveled, the sense of dread only deepened, leaving the passengers to grapple with their darkest fears. The next chapter promised to unravel more of the mystery that surrounded the passenger without a face and the eerie journey that had only just begun. As the train forged ahead, the once familiar surroundings of the passengers became increasingly alien. The air was thick with a pervasive sense of dread, and every sound seemed to echo with a sinister resonance. The passenger without a face had not moved, but his presence was felt more intensely than ever, as if he were a silent conductor orchestrating the growing terror. The fog outside had thickened, and the train was now traversing what appeared to be an endless, pitch-black tunnel. The occasional flicker of the lights cast eerie shadows that danced and twisted on the walls, creating a nightmarish landscape that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The passengers huddled together, their faces pale with fear, each one trying to hold on to their sanity as the reality around them warped into something grotesque. Suddenly, an inexplicable coldness swept through the car, causing the passengers to shiver uncontrollably. The temperature dropped sharply, and the fog inside the train grew denser, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Shadows began to take on unsettling forms, coalescing into shapes that seemed almost human. The passenger without a face remained the only constant in the midst of this surreal nightmare, his presence an unspoken threat that seemed to manipulate the shadows. Whispers started to spread among the passengers, each one recounting their own personal fears and anxieties. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces now reflecting the deepest insecurities of those within. Some passengers reported seeing figures from their pasts, their own ghosts manifesting in the darkness. The fear was palpable, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. The passenger without a face did nothing to quell the rising panic. Instead, he seemed to embody the very essence of the terror that enveloped the train. His stillness was more menacing than any action, his presence a constant reminder of the unknown horrors that lay ahead. The shadows continued to shift and writhe, amplifying the passengers' fears and distorting their perception of reality. The train journey continued through the oppressive darkness, each passing moment heightening the sense of dread. The passengers were left to confront their deepest fears, unsure of what awaited them at the end of their nightmarish journey. The next chapter would reveal further secrets about the true nature of the passenger without a face and the ominous journey that lay ahead. Had changed in his aura. The tension in the air seemed to have grown palpably, as if the very structure of the train was transforming into a gateway to another dimension. Passengers were now in a state of near panic, each sound and movement amplified by their terrified minds. Then a strange phenomenon began. The walls of the carriage started to warp and undulate, as if made of mist. The passenger without a face slowly stood up, his movements graceful and almost ethereal, and a murmur of fear passed through the passengers. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and dread, as if the revelation of a terrible secret was imminent. Suddenly, an eerie green light began to emanate from the passenger without a face. It was a pale, spectral glow that illuminated the carriage with an otherworldly brightness. With the light came visions of indistinct figures, the seven beyond, as they had come to be known. These figures, ghostly and formless, manifested slowly, filling the carriage with a sense of supernatural presence. Each figure radiated an aura of despair and suffering, their faces twisted in eternal terror. The collective shock was palpable when one of the braver passengers tried to communicate with the figures. His words came out as a hesitant whisper, and the figures responded with a cacophony of whispers that filled everyone's minds with feelings of loss and confusion. The words were indecipherable, but the emotional impact was profound and disturbing. The sensation of contact with something beyond human understanding was overwhelming. The visions of the seven beyond began to intensify, blending with the deepest fears and secrets of the passengers. With each new flash of green light, a new horrifying image appeared. Scenes of disasters, tragedies, and ancient horrors seemed to be relived. The carriage was now immersed in a distorted reality where past and present intertwined in a grotesque and uncontrollable manner. As the green light began to fade and the figures of the seven beyond dissolved into the darkness, the train seemed to resume its route, but the impact of the revelation was undeniable. The passenger without a face returned to his seat, unfazed, while the passengers, dazed and terrified, struggled to process what they had witnessed. The next chapter promised to delve deeper into the mystery, revealing more about the connection between the seven beyond and the train's journey into the unknown. The train continued its journey at a pace that was almost imperceptible, its travel increasingly slow and unsettling. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of dread, as if the train had become suspended between the worlds of the living and the unknown. The passenger without a face remained still, a silent observer in the midst of growing chaos. The train seemed to be in a limbo, where the boundaries of reality and time blurred. Inside the train, the scene was one of complete disarray, with passengers murmuring and moving restlessly, as if trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Every sound was muffled, mingled with incomprehensible whispers and distant echoes from an alternate reality. It felt as though the very structure of the train was undergoing a metamorphosis, its components and passengers merging into something new and unrecognizable. The feeling of being between two worlds grew stronger with each passing moment. A woman, visibly distressed, began to see images of deceased loved ones. They appeared in fleeting flashes, like painful memories that refused to fade. Each vision was laden with profound sadness and a desperation that the woman could not comprehend. The passenger without a face watched silently as the visions became a relentless torment, blending with the woman's own fears and anxieties. Interactions among the passengers grew increasingly bizarre and fragmented. Some struggled to distinguish between reality and the visions they were experiencing, arguing with invisible figures and trying to interact with things that were not there. Fear spread like a contagious disease, and the train transformed into a maze of memories and phobias, a distortion of the passengers' perceptions. As the journey went on, the passenger without a face began to move more frequently, his steps echoing in a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. His presence seemed to have a growing influence over the train's environment, as if manipulating the very essence of the space they occupied. The passengers, increasingly disturbed, desperately tried to make sense of the escalating chaos around them. The sensation of being in between worlds, on the brink of a terrifying revelation, continued to escalate. The train moved forward slowly, and reality seemed to unravel around the passengers. As the train rumbled onward, its pace seemed to slow even further, making the journey feel like a torturous eternity. The air was thick with a palpable sense of impending doom, and the atmosphere inside the carriage was charged with an almost electric tension. The faceless passenger remained in his seat, an eerie stillness that contrasted sharply with the growing hysteria among the other passengers. The temperature in the carriage plummeted abruptly, and the windows were coated in a thick frost that distorted the outside world into an unrecognizable blur. The fog that had once been a mere inconvenience now enveloped the train, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Shadows, once merely unsettling, now seemed to take on solid forms, shifting and coalescing into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at the terrified passengers. Then, as if the train were responding to an unseen force, it began to shudder violently. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting fleeting, grotesque shadows that danced around the carriage like malevolent spirits. The passengers, their faces twisted in terror, could barely cling to their seats as the train seemed to be tearing apart the very fabric of reality. The faceless passenger finally moved, standing slowly and deliberately. His presence seemed to command the shadows and the cold, as if he were the source of the train's malevolent energy. The air crackled with a supernatural force, and the figures of the seven beyond began to reappear, their ghostly forms now more defined and menacing than ever. The faceless passenger's stillness was now a stark contrast to the chaotic energy that filled the carriage. The passengers were now at their breaking point, unable to escape the nightmare that had become their reality. Some screamed in futile attempts to flee, while others fell silent, overwhelmed by the sheer terror of their situation. The shadows closed in, their forms now indistinguishable from the fears that had plagued the passengers throughout the journey. The train seemed to be hurtling towards an inevitable, horrifying climax. With one final, bone-chilling shudder, the train came to a stop. The carriage was filled with an oppressive silence, the kind that follows the climax of a great storm. The faceless passenger remained as he had always been, silent, inscrutable, and terrifying. The journey was over, but the true horror of what had transpired remained. A lingering darkness that would haunt the survivors long after the train had disappeared into the night.